You ever meet someone who's been underestimated so long they've started using it as a weapon? Because that's the story I'm about to tell you. And I need you to stick around for the part where a woman in a $5 hair clip walks into a room full of killers and makes every single one of them step out her way. Not with a gun, with a folder. Trust me, it's better than it sounds. Here's the setup. There's a man named Dominic Rourke, and in the world he runs, cruelty isn't a character flaw. It's a form of currency. It's how you show people you can afford to be careless with them. And Dominic spent that currency the way rich men spend cash in a foreign country. Fast, thoughtlessly, without ever really checking the exchange rate. So when he invited his painfully forgettable secretary to the most dangerous, most expensive party of the year, it wasn't kindness. It wasn't even curiosity. It was a joke. A bet, honestly. A chance to stand in a beautiful ballroom and watch a quiet woman fall apart in front of people who eat quiet women for breakfast. He was expecting a lumpy cardigan, maybe a nervous laugh. Best case, in his mind, a panic attack in a coat closet. What walked through those doors instead ended his entire understanding of himself in about 4 seconds. But we've got to back up, because you need to understand what kind of place this was. The Rourke organization didn't run out of a basement with a card table and a guy named Sal. It ran out of the 51st floor of a glass tower downtown, the kind of building where the lobby has a water feature and a guy in a headset who knows your name before you say it. The floors were imported stone. The coffee came from a single farm in a country most of the staff couldn't find on a map. And the violence? The violence had been laundered so thoroughly it looked like a quarterly report. Nobody said, "We broke his legs." They said, "We resolved the account." And the woman who kept all those accounts straight was named Winifred Pace. Everybody called her Winnie, mostly because they had to call her something. Winnie was 28 and had perfected a very specific skill. Not accounting, though she was frighteningly good at that. Her real skill was disappearing while standing in a well-lit room. She wore slacks in a color you could only describe as damp sidewalk. Her blouses buttoned to the throat and came from stores that smelled like potpourri and quiet disappointment. Her hair, the sort of non-committal mousy brown, got yanked back every morning into a plastic clip. So tight it gave her a low-grade headache by 10. And here's the thing. She liked the headache. It kept her sharp. It reminded her where she was. Because Winnie knew exactly who signed her paychecks. You don't spend 3 years processing invoices for industrial quantities of lime and heavy plastic sheeting and tell yourself you work at a nice real estate firm. She'd done the math. She'd always done the math. But the dental was incredible. The 401k matched at 7%. And I swear this is true. The mob took workplace harassment extremely seriously. Some guy whistled at her in the break room during her second week. That man got transferred to logistics, and nobody ever saw him again. Winnie filed the paperwork herself. She did not ask follow-up questions, so she survived the only way she knew how. She became furniture. She was a lamp. She was the stapler. She was the second printer that nobody used. Every morning at 8:15, she set a black coffee on Dominic Rourke's desk, pretended not to notice the rust-colored fleck on his shirt cuff, and went back to her cubicle to balance ledgers that quietly hid 3 different kinds of felony. Now, Dominic was 32, and he was all sharp edges and cold arithmetic. He'd taken the organization over from his father 3 years back and dragged it, kicking and bleeding, into the modern era. Under the old man, it was chaos and grudges. Under Dominic, it was org charts and profit margins. He didn't smile. He evaluated. And lately, and this is a dangerous part, he was bored. Boredom in a man like that doesn't look like restlessness. It looks like a twitch in the jaw. It looks like noticing tiny flaws in the people around you and turning them over like coins. Which brings us to his cousin, Bobby Callahan, the underboss. Loud, reckless, sloppy, and absolutely delighted by his own sense of humor. Bobby leaned on Dominic's desk one afternoon with a drink in his hand, watching Winnie through the glass wall, and said, "She's not real. I'm telling you, cut her open, you'll find batteries." Dominic didn't look up. "She's efficient. She's a ghost in orthopedic shoes." Bobby took a slow sip. "I bet she's never had a drink in her life. Remember when Jimmy got shot in the lobby? She stepped over him. Didn't scream, didn't blink, Just asked if the elevators were still running. She had a filing deadline that morning. Dominic said flatly, "Okay, but come on." And here's where Bobby's face lit up with that specific glow men get right before they suggest something ugly. The Midwinter Ball is Friday. Every heavy hitter in the city's going to be there. Bring her. Dominic finally looked up. "Tell her it's mandatory," Bobby said. "Tell her to dress up. Watch her show up in a tweed skirt and church shoes. You, walking into that room with a librarian. The faces alone, Dom. And then watch her try to make small talk with the guys from the east side. She'll probably hand somebody a spreadsheet. It's perfect." Dominic looked back through the glass. Winnie was squinting at her monitor, chewing on the end of a chewed-up pen, shoulders rounded like a question mark. She looked soft. She looked breakable. She looked like the only harmless thing on the entire floor. And a little flicker of amusement went off in his chest. He knew it was petty. He knew it was beneath him. He did it anyway. "If she cries," he said quietly, "you're handling it. Deal." And when it came time for makeup, she didn't ask for natural. She didn't ask for pretty. She asked for war. Blood-red lip, eyes lined heavy and smoked out black. When she finally stood up and looked in the full-length mirror, her breath caught, because the woman looking back wasn't a secretary who kept the books for the mob. She looked like a woman who owned the mob. She slid those cold chains over her shoulders, stepped into the steel-tipped heels, picked up the clutch. "Let's go hear the punchline," she said to the empty room. Now the ballroom. Picture it. Chandeliers throwing warm gold light over a sea of custom tuxedos. A string quartet in the corner, doing their absolute best to ignore that roughly half the men in the room were actively planning to kill the other half. It smelled like orchids and bourbon and money that had been washed several times. Dominic stood near the bar with a scotch he wasn't drinking, nodding at people, accepting respectful, slightly terrified greetings. And underneath all of it, there was this tight coil at the base of his neck he couldn't shake. 8:15, she was late. Winnie Pace had never been late, not once in 3 years. She bailed, Bobby said, materializing at his elbow, looking smug and pleased with the world. "I'm telling you." She got to the lobby, saw somebody's shoulder holster, and ran home to her cats. "She doesn't have cats," Dominic said. "Whatever. Point is, your little ghost couldn't hack it. Honestly? Good. She would have looked like a substitute teacher. Would have killed the whole vibe." Dominic didn't answer. He looked into his glass and felt something heavy and ugly sitting in his gut, and it took him an embarrassingly long time to identify it, because he hadn't felt it in years. It was shame. He'd bullied a civilian. He'd used everything he was to humiliate a woman whose only crime was keeping his empire organized. It was sloppy. It was arrogant. It made him feel exactly like his father. "Getting another drink," he muttered. "Suit yourself," Bobby laughed. "I'm going to go see if anybody wants to bet on how fast you fire her Monday." Dominic took one step toward the bar, and then the room changed. It wasn't silence, exactly. It was a pressure drop, that feeling in the air right before a storm cracks open. The hum of conversation stuttered. The cellist scraped a note and had to recover, and heads started turning, one after another, toward the doors. Dominic stopped walking. The hair stood up on his arms. Pure predator instinct, because 100 dangerous men had just locked onto the same point in space, and every one of them had gone still. He turned around expecting a rival, maybe a raid. He saw her, and Dominic Rourke, a man who had not been afraid of anything in about a decade, felt genuine fear, and then, right behind it, something much worse, something starving. So here's where it gets good. The banker's name was Marcus Feld. Damp handshake, gray suit, permanently sweating. He handled the routing to the shell companies, and he'd been skimming a little off the top for years. Dominic knew. Dominic had estimated it at maybe $50,000 a year and decided it wasn't worth the hassle of finding a new banker. A little theft is the cost of doing business. Winnie cut through that ballroom like a knife through soft tissue. Dominic actually had to work to keep up, and he genuinely did not know what to do with his hands. He ended up shoving them in his pockets like a teenager. "Feld," she said quietly as they walked. Gray suit by the ice sculpture. Sweating. He should be. Dominic said. Feld watched them come. His eyes went from Dominic's unreadable face to the woman walking in perfect step beside him, and his knuckles went white on his martini glass. Marcus, Dominic said. Mr. Rourke. A squeak. Then to Winnie, and, your guess. Winifred Pace. She did not offer her hand. She just stopped 2 feet away and let the silence sit there until it had weight. A pleasure, Feld lied. Mr. Feld. Her voice was a scalpel. I've been reviewing the third quarter routing protocols, specifically the transfer lag between the shell entity in Nassau and the primary holding account. There's a consistent 48-hour delay, and at current overnight rates, a 48-hour delay generates a very specific yield. Feld stopped breathing. All the color left his face at once. International transfers take time, he stammered. Bank compliance. Bank compliance is automated, she said. I pulled the network logs. The delay isn't systemic. It's manual. Someone is parking our funds in a high-yield intermediary for exactly 2 days before passing the principal along. They keep the interest. She took a sip of sparkling water off a passing tray, let the silence stretch out and suffocate him. Over 3 years, she continued, and there was nothing in her eyes at all, that compounds to roughly $412,000. Give or take exchange rate drift. Feld's glass slid out of his fingers and hit the carpet with a dull thud, and Dominic felt a cold thrill go straight up his spine, because he had known Feld was stealing. He had not known it was $400,000, and he definitely had not known how. Dominic, she's making it up. Feld choked. Who is this? Some auditor. She's my secretary, Dominic said softly, and then he smiled. First time all week. And she balances my books. That's when Bobby shoved into the circle, flushed, holding a fresh drink, furious that the center of gravity in the room had moved without his permission. He looked Winnie up and down with a nasty mix of hostility and something else. Nice costume, Pace. Rented by the hour? Crude. Stupid. A man trying to shove a woman back into the box she climbed out of. Winnie turned her head slowly. Mr. Callahan, she said, in a conversational murmur that somehow carried over the quartet. I noticed the catering budget for your weekly sector meetings jumped 40% this quarter. The invoices show you ordering imported Wagyu for 15 men every Tuesday, from a supplier owned by your brother-in-law. Bobby's mouth opened. Nothing came out. If you're going to embezzle from your own cousin, she said, leaning in maybe an inch, don't do it through a paper trail of stakes. It's uninspired, and it insults me personally, because I'm the one who has to file it. Then she turned back to Feld, who was now doing something with his breathing that looked medically concerning. Have the $412,000 wired to the primary operational account by Monday at 9, Mr. Feld, or Mr. Rourke will stop delegating to me and start delegating to the men by the exits. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned on that steel heel and walked out toward the terrace. Monday at 9, Dominic repeated to Feld, and he followed her out into the cold. Now, here's the part one actually loved, because out on that terrace, the armor came off a little. She was gripping the stone railing with both hands, and she was shaking. Hard, heart going like a bird in a box, because the adrenaline was draining out and reality was coming in, and reality said, you just humiliated an underboss and threatened a banker in front of the entire city. She heard the door. She knew his walk. Dominic stopped beside her, lit a cigarette, and for a while just looked out at the traffic below. You're shaking, he said, and his voice wasn't the flat off his voice. It was rough. Quiet. It's 30 degrees, Mr. Rourke. He took off his jacket, heavy wool, silk lining, worth more than a rent, and draped it over her bare shoulders. It smelled like cedar and tobacco and the entire violent world he lived in. She stiffened. She didn't pull away. She pulled the lapels tighter. 3 years, he said, leaning on the railing. You sat outside my door for 3 years apologizing when the copier jammed, acting like a loud noise might kill you. A loud noise on the 51st floor is usually a hollow point, she said. Flinching is a survival mechanism. He turned to look at her. Why hide it? You have a mind like a bear trap. You gutted Feld in 60 seconds. You could have been running the whole finance division. I'd have paid you triple. And that's when she turned around, and 3 years of swallowed anger came up all at once. "You wouldn't have paid me triple," she said. "You would have noticed me." He frowned. "Look at that room. Look at those men. Look at your cousin. Look at you." She gestured back at the glass doors. "You run a machine built on violence and ego and paranoia. Do you know what happens to a woman who stands out in a place like that? A woman who shows she's smart or capable or dangerous." He didn't say anything. The ash on his cigarette burned down. "She becomes a threat," Winnie said, answering herself. "Or she becomes property. She gets targeted by men like your cousin, who cannot stand being outsmarted by the furniture." Her voice cracked and kept going. "I have $90,000 in student loans. My mother is in a memory care facility that costs $6,000 a month. I needed the salary. I needed the insurance. I did not need to prove a point." She stepped back from the railing, swimming in his enormous jacket, and somehow looking 3 times bigger than she ever had in that cubicle. "So I wore the gray slacks. I wore the clip. I scrubbed off my face, and I looked at the floor, and I let Bobby call me a ghost, because being visible was the only way to stay safe in a building full of predators." And Dominic felt that knot in his chest again. Shame! Twice in one night. New record. Because he'd told himself he was a good boss. He kept the violence out of the office. He paid well. And he had been completely, comfortably blind to the actual ecosystem he'd built. He let Bobby sneer for 3 years. And then he dragged her into the middle of it as a bit. "So, why tonight?" he asked quietly. "Why drop it now?" She laughed. "And there was nothing funny in it. Because you dragged me into the spotlight. I knew why you invited me. I heard Bobby. I knew the punchline." She stepped closer, tilted her head back, met his eyes, and did not blink. "If I'd walked in there in a cardigan, you would have laughed. He would have laughed. I had been a joke, but a humiliated one. The invisibility would have been over either way. You forced my hand. So if I was going into the snake pit, the snakes were going to find out I have teeth." Dominic looked down at her, and the anger in her face was honestly magnificent. It was earned. She played a perfect game for 3 years, and he'd flipped the board because he was bored on a Tuesday. He crushed out his cigarette. "You made an enemy tonight," he said. "Bobby's petty. He holds grudges. I'm aware. Fell will run. He'll be handled before Monday. But that leaves a hole in the offshore routing. I can reroute through a different shell in Belize," she said instantly. "No pause. No hedge. Cuts transfer time to 12 hours, and scrubs the trail cleaner than Feld ever managed." Dominic let out a long breath, and in the quiet after it, both of them understood that the old arrangement was dead. The desk lamp had just plugged itself into the city grid. "Monday morning," he said, voice dropping low. "You don't wear the gray." Her hands tightened on his jacket. "Are you firing me?" "No." He stepped in until he could smell that ozone again. Looked at the red mouth, the sharp eyes, all that beautiful fury coming off her skin. "I'm promoting you." And then he walked back inside, because he had a banker to find and a cousin to muzzle and an entirely new reality to start building. Monday morning. 8:15, the elevator opens. No gray wool. A charcoal pinstripe suit that fit her like it had opinions. No plastic clip. Dark hair falling a sharp line along her jaw. Black leather pumps, no steel tips, and somehow the exact same threat. Lipstick in a muted, business-appropriate plum. Eyes lined in unforgiving black. The silence rolled across that floor like a wave. It started at reception, where the assistant literally stopped typing mid-word. It rippled through the bullpen. Conversations died halfway through sentences. And Winnie walked right past the admin cluster. Didn't even slow down. She walked to the corner office next to Dominic's, the one that had been empty since the last CFO got indicted, and then, well, stopped existing. The glass door was open. Her name was already on a brushed steel plaque. Winifred Pace, Director of Financial Operations. Inside, a mahogany desk the size of a car, 2 curved monitors, an encrypted line, and 1 black coffee, still steaming. "I take it with oat milk now," she said to the empty room. "Noted." Dominic stepped out of the private corridor connecting their offices. Navy suit, no tie, top buttons open. He looked rested, which was a lie. He hadn't slept since Friday. He'd spent the weekend dismantling Marcus Feld's entire life and putting the man on a one-way flight to a country with no extradition treaty. He tossed a silver flash drive onto her desk. It clattered on the wood. Authorization codes, signatures, everything. Full systemic control. She looked at it. That little piece of metal was the key to the whole treasury. Billions in laundered funds, rackets, real estate. And he was handing it to a woman he'd thought was a piece of office equipment 72 hours earlier. "You're trusting me with all of it," she said. "I'm trusting you to be who you were on Friday night. Someone who understands the margins better than anyone in this building." And that's exactly when the glass door flew open hard enough to strain the hinges. Bobby Callahan came in hot, face dark red, marched right past Winnie to Dominic. She gets the corner office. She gets a title. She's a glorified typist, Dom. You're making a joke out of the chain of command. Dominic didn't move, didn't blink, and the temperature in that room dropped about 40 degrees. "Bobby," he said in a whisper, "lower your voice." Bobby didn't. He wheeled on Winnie instead and slammed both palms on her desk. "You think because you played dress-up at a party you're one of us? You're a civilian. First time things get bloody, you'll break." Winnie folded her hands over the flash drive, looked up at him with absolutely nothing on her face. "Mr. Callahan, I'm currently reviewing the discretionary funds for your operations in the warehouse district. You're running a 22% loss year over year. You are paying off inspectors who were indicted by the state 8 months ago, which means you're pouring organization money into a hole in the ground." His mouth opened. No sound came out. "As of this morning, your discretionary budget is frozen. Every expenditure over $500 requires my written approval. If you want to buy a box of ammunition, you will submit an itemized receipt." Bobby turned to his cousin, eyes wide. "You're letting her do this? She's cutting my legs off. She's stopping you from bleeding my money," Dominic said. "Dead flat. She is the director of finance. You answer to her on anything with a $sign on it. Speak to her like that again, and you'll be managing garbage routes on the far side of the river. Are we clear?" The silence was suffocating, and Bobby realized with a nasty cold shock that his cousin was not bluffing. The hierarchy had moved. The joke was now the judge. He shot her one venomous look. "This is a mistake, Dom." And he slammed the door on his way out. Winnie sat perfectly still until his footsteps faded, then let out one slow breath and dropped her shoulders about half an inch. "He's going to retaliate," she said. "Let him try." Dominic leaned down to her eye level. "Cedar and cold air. You handle the math. I'll handle the monsters." 3 weeks went by, and they were brutal and exhausting and almost perfectly smooth. Winnie reorganized an entire financial architecture, like a surgeon cutting out a tumor. She killed deadweight. She streamlined payouts. She terrified grown men who did genuinely terrible things for a living, by emailing them spreadsheets with their inefficiencies highlighted in red. Word got around fast. A beating heals. A Winifred Pace audit does not. 15-hour days. He matched her hour for hour. They lived in adjoining offices in a state of caffeinated isolation, passing files back and forth, eating cold takeout at midnight, talking in this clipped shorthand of risk and reallocation, and the tension between them was becoming genuinely unbearable. Every time he handed her a document, his fingers stayed a half-second too long. Every time she looked up from her monitors, he was in the doorway, watching her with a hunger he'd stopped bothering to hide. They'd gone from predator and prey to two of the same animals circling the same cage, neither sure who was supposed to move first. It broke on a Tuesday at 1 a.m, rain smearing the windows into bleeding neon, whole floor dark except her desk lamps. "It bounced again," she muttered, rubbing her temples. Dominic appeared with 2 scotches and set one by her keyboard. "Belize? The secondary shell is rejecting the transfer. And it's not an automated flag. Somebody's manually blocking it on the receiving end." He pulled a chair over, sat close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "Who controls the node?" "Rafael Ocampo." She pulled a file onto the second monitor. "Cartel liaison. Handles regional distribution for the whole southern corridor." Feld dealt with him directly. Ocampo is a paranoid sociopath, Dominic said. If he's blocking it, he thinks it's a trap. He knows Feld is gone. He doesn't trust a new signature. He wants a face-to-face. She pointed at a secure thread. Sent an encrypted ping an hour ago. He wants to meet the new director. Tomorrow night, New Orleans. And every relaxed line in Dominic's body went rigid. No, it's not a request. $12 million is sitting in purgatory. Another 48 hours, and federal algorithms flag the volume, and we lose all of it. I said no. He stood up and paced. I'll go. I'll take a crew, sit down with him, and make him release the codes. She swiveled her chair. You can't. He doesn't want muscle. He wants the architect. He has to see that the person pushing the buttons isn't a federal agent who sees Feld's laptop. You walk with a crew. He burns the accounts and vanishes. He is a cartel enforcer, Winnie. He came back at her, eyes blazing. He flays people for skimming. You are not sitting in a room with him. She stood up. I'm the director of finance. This is my route. This is my math. You put me in that chair to fix a machine. Let me fix it. You fix it from in here. He was inches away now, glaring down. You don't go into the field. You don't sit across a table from men who treat human beings like rounding errors. She stared right back up at him and said, very softly, men like you? And that stopped him cold. The anger in his face just cracked, and underneath it was raw, undignified panic, because he didn't want her safe as an asset. He wanted her safe because the idea of Rafael Ocampo so much as looking at her made his blood go to ice. I am not letting you walk into a cartel-safe house, he said, and it came out ragged. Then walk in with me. Her heart was slamming, but her voice was steady. No crew. No Bobby. Just you. You're the boss. I'm your proxy. We show him one united front. Ocampo respects power. If he sees you standing behind my play, he'll release the hold. And Dominic looked at her, the set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes, and understood that this woman was not a mousy secretary, and not just a corporate shark. She was his equal. She understood the risk, she understood the blood, and she was willing to step into it. He reached out and took her arm, and his grip was tight. If anything goes wrong, if he so much as breathes wrong in your direction, the math stops matching. I'll burn his whole operation to ash. Understood, she said, and the shiver that went through her had nothing to do with the rain. Pack a bag. Wheels up at dawn. New Orleans. Ocampo picked a glass conference room on the top floor of a high-rise, and he cranked the air conditioning down so far the place felt like a walk-in freezer. That's a tactic, by the way. He liked his guests uncomfortable. He sat at the head of a long marble table with two men in linen suits that didn't quite hang right at the waist. Late 40s, gold watch, dead eyes. He didn't stand when they walked in. Dominic pulled out Winnie's chair, waited for her to sit, then took the seat beside her and ignored the armed men completely. Winnie wore a bone-white suit, hair pulled back into a low, severe knot. She looked like an executioner who just scrubbed in. Rourke. Ocampo's voice was gravel. I expected an entourage. Not you and an accountant. This is Winifred Pace, Dominic said, quiet enough that the room had to lean in. Director of Finance. She built the new routing system. You wanted to meet the person pushing the buttons. Here she is. Ocampo laughed, dry as paper. Feld was a rat, but he understood the ecosystem. This girl pings me demanding a $12 million release. I don't move cartel money for strangers, especially strangers in lipstick. The two guards smirked. Winnie reached into her briefcase, pulled out one thin manila folder, and slid it across the marble. It stopped an inch from his hands. Open it. He stopped smiling. He glanced at Dominic, who hadn't moved a muscle and was watching all of this with something that looked a lot like pride. Ocampo flipped it open. I don't want respect, Mr. Ocampo, she said calm, her voice bouncing gently off the glass. I want efficiency. Under Feld, operational loss to your handling fees ran about 4% a quarter. You said that covered bribes to port authorities. His face stayed blank, but a muscle in his jaw jumped. I cross-referenced the port schedules against the wire transfers, she went on, leaning back. You aren't bribing anyone. The signature receiving those diversions belongs to a shell corporation in Panama, wholly owned by your brother-in-law. The room went absolutely silent. The air conditioning suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Both guards shifted their weight, hands drifting toward their waists. Dominic didn't move an inch, but his eyes tracked them, and he was fully prepared to end both men before either one cleared leather. Ocampo looked up from the paper like she'd set a live grenade on the table. "You are stealing from your own bosses, Raphael," she said, dropping the mister, which somehow made it 1,000 times worse. $12 million of my organization's money is in a holding account. If you don't authorize the release in the next 3 minutes, I press one button on this phone. That button forwards this exact breakdown to your cartel's internal auditor. I suspect they're less forgiving about a 4% handling fee than Mr. Rourke has been. He stared at her, at the flat line of her mouth, at the total, unnerving absence of fear. And here's the thing that broke him. Raphael Ocampo made his living on terror. It was his whole trade, and he realized, sitting there in that freezing glass box, that the woman across from him was completely immune to it. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a spreadsheet, and it was going to get him killed. "You're bluffing," he rasped. Winnie picked up her phone, unlocked it, put her thumb over send. 2 minutes. Ocampo looked at Dominic. "You're letting her do this? She'll start a war." "She's doing the math, Raphael," Dominic said in this low, lethal hum. "I'd pay attention. She carries the one with extreme prejudice." Ocampo looked back at the phone, at those cold, clinical eyes. He swallowed hard. Then he pulled out a satellite phone, punched in a sequence, and set on the table. A small green light blinked twice. "Released," he said, and every syllable was strangled. "It's routing." Winnie refreshed the application she'd built herself. Watch $12 million evaporate out of purgatory and land safe in the primary offshore node. "Pleasure doing business, Raphael." She stood, smoothed her jacket, and picked the folder back up off the table. She did not leave it behind. "I'll send a revised schedule for the fourth quarter. I expect it processed without delay, and without the 4%. Dominic stood. He didn't say one word to Ocampo. He just put a hand on the small of her back and walked her out, leaving a cartel enforcer sweating in a room set to 60 degrees. The crash hit her the second the hotel suite door shut. Knees like water. She dropped her briefcase and leaned hard on the back of a sofa with her palms pressed into her eyes. Her heart was going so fast it hurt. She had just extorted a cartel boss. She had looked a killer in the face and threatened his life with a data transfer. "Drink," Dominic said, holding out bourbon. Jacket gone, sleeves rolled up, old ink winding up his forearms. Her hand shook so badly the liquid sloshed. She drank it in one swallow. He took the glass and set it down and did not step back. "I'm terrified," she admitted, and it came out of her like something tearing. "I'm terrified almost every second of every day. I was terrified in that cubicle. I was terrified at the party. I was terrified in that room. You didn't look it. That's the job." She looked up at him. "You taught me that. They only respect the armor. You never let them see the blood." And Dominic looked down at this woman. The exhaustion under her eyes, the jaw, the fierce, unbreakable brain, and thought he'd never seen anything better in his life. He reached out and pulled the knot from her hair. It fell dark around her shoulders. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his hand, barely, a surrender about a millimeter wide, and it hit him like a shockwave. "I walked past your desk for 3 years, he said, thumb along her cheekbone. 3 years looking right through you. Biggest failure of my life. You were looking at the furniture. I was blind." He didn't ask, and she didn't need him to. He closed the last inch, and it wasn't gentle and it wasn't sweet. It was a collision. 3 years of pressure, a survived cartel sit-down, and a dizzying realization that they were the same animal wearing different suits. She fisted her hands at his shirt and pulled him in and matched him exactly. When they finally broke apart, the sun was going down over the water, throwing bruised purple and gold across the room. She kept her forehead against his chest, listening to his heart going way too fast. "Bobby's going to move," she said, "because reality always comes back. I know. He's broke, he's desperate, and desperate men get sloppy. He'll try to route around my protocols, and when he can't, he'll come after me. He won't get within 10 miles of you, Dominic said, and his voice went to solid stone. If he steps out of line, I'm not reassigning him. I'm burying him. Winnie pulled back and looked up into those cold, pale eyes. No, she said. He frowned. Don't bury him. And she smiled, and honestly, it was terrifying. Audit him. Publicly. Strip the assets. Freeze the accounts. And make him stand in front of the commission and explain every stolen dollar. Let him live. Make him irrelevant. She shrugged one shoulder. Death makes a martyr. Poverty makes a punchline. Dominic stared at her, and then he laughed, this low, dark, genuinely reverent sound, because he had spent his whole life building a fortress out of violence, and she'd just shown him how to turn the architecture itself into a weapon. You, he said, pressing a hard kiss to her jaw, are going to be the absolute ruin of me. I'm going to double your margin, she corrected, sliding her hands up to frame his face. And I'm going to look incredible doing it. 2 days later, Winifred Pace stepped onto the 51st floor. The whole bullpen went quiet and watched her walk. No gray, no looking at the floor. She went straight into the corner office, and a glass door clicked shut behind her, sealing her into an empire she now ran with him instead of under him. The invisible secretary was gone. Long live the director. So, be honest with me. What was your favorite moment? Was it the staircase? Was it that folder sliding across the marble table in a room full of armed men? Or was it the quiet one on the terrace, when she finally said out loud that being invisible was never shyness? It was strategy? Because that's really what this whole story is about. Everybody in that building looked at Winnie and saw a piece of office furniture, and not one of them stopped to ask why a woman that smart was working that hard at being forgettable. They confused quiet with harmless. And it cost them $400,000, one banker, an underboss, and a cartel's cut. If you enjoyed watching a woman weaponize a spreadsheet, do me a favor, hit that like button, because it genuinely helps more than you'd think. Share this with a friend who's obsessed with dark, high-stakes romance. You know exactly who I'm talking about. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because I got stories lined up that are somehow even more unhinged than this one. Drop a comment and tell me which line hit hardest. I read all of them.